All right, good afternoon, everyone. Tuesday, April 22nd, 1 o'clock. We're going to take a sec and discuss the minor instance of amendment on H10 and act relating to the approval of amendments to the charter of the city of Barry. Council is with us to discuss the minor change, and it is posted on the website. So if you want to take a look real quick, we're going to discuss this and take a straw vote on it after council concludes. Council.
Good afternoon, Tucker Anderson, Legislative Council. You should have in front of you the Senate's proposal of amendment for H10. The Senate took a look at some of the existing underlying language in the City of Barry Charter as you passed it out in H10 and noticed what we have come to call the Zepto second error. And that is when the fiscal year is described as beginning on a specific day or time and ending on a specific day or time. In the way that we interpret statute, those triggers happen typically on midnight of the day that is specified. And because of the way these charters are structured, sometimes there's an infinitesimally small amount of time where the fiscal year doesn't exist. And we try to clean that up and eliminate it. In this case, the City of Barry Charter eliminated an entire day of the fiscal year. And it's been that way for a while. This is in the underlying language. So the Senate struck out a clause that reads, "and end on the last day of June," to ensure that the fiscal year just begins on the first day of July and rolls into the next fiscal year.
Okay, that actually makes a lot of sense.
Right?
Yeah.
Yes. All right, now I understand.
All right. Any questions for council? Okay. So, I misunderstood sort of like procedural steps. I thought we were gonna like see the bill come back down here. So good thinking on your feet, team, for delaying action for the day so we could have this conversation and take a straw poll on it. So, any questions or discussion? No? Okay. So, straw poll to accept and find favorable this change by the Senate. All right, VL, that is a 10-0-1. Favorable to accept. All right. Takes care of that piece. Thank you, sir. And next up, we are doing an introduction and a walkthrough on H376, an act relating to the creation of the Treatment and Recovery Fund and the labeling and taxation of alcoholic beverages. Representative Nugent's bill. And would you like to do an introduction before the walkthrough, Representative? Sure. Or, yeah. However we want to do this. Got a couple hours for it.
I wrote a novel.
How you doing, Representative?
So thanks for hearing this intro. So like most people, I've had family members and friends affected by excessive alcohol use and, whether it's car accidents or cancer treatments, or cancer or other health issues. And so this bill is attempts to address that problem through multiple angles. The first thing that it would do is raise the excise tax on alcohol by about 6 cents. So right now, it's like 2 cents a drink, and it would be raised 6 cents. So that would be 8 cents a drink, and then 10% on spirits. And so this is estimated that it would raise between $16 and $17 million for the state. And those funds would go into a treatment and recovery fund that would help offset some of the cost to the state of this excessive alcohol use. So specifically called out in the bill are things like treatment and recovery. It could go to detox beds, which are in short supply and often not long enough for people to actually recover. It would also go towards student services in schools that are not adequate, and there are not enough of that. There is not enough of that right now. And then other treatment services. Taxes are one of the most impactful ways to reduce excessive use, and so it would also go to reduce the cost of healthcare by reducing the use itself. And this bill also has a significant component for consumer and safety protection. It would require a label on beverages that would include allergens and major ingredients, as well as alcohol by volume, which is actually not required on all beverages in Vermont. So you don't necessarily see that in every beverage. And then how many standard servings per container, and then a cancer warning. And finally, the bill would require a study to study online compliance checks, because we've heard that that has a lot of non-compliance. So that's like sales to minors on the online environment has been not going super well. So it would require DLL to study that and see how they could make improvements. So that is those are the major components of it.
Okay. Oh, yeah, Representative Morgan, go ahead.
Yeah, so Kate, the money would be used, would stay in the lane of alcohol is your intent, not branch out, potentially be robbed for some other whatever. Is that your intent?
Yeah, that's why it creates a fund, so that it would have to be used for treatment. Yep.
Of alcohol issue related issues. Okay, thank you.
The type of like labeling adjustments that you're talking about with like the cancer warnings and whatnot, are there examples in other states of that?
Ireland has a cancer warning, and I'm not sure if other states have that or not right now.
Mhm. Yeah,
I think, well, actually, California, I believe, has one because they have really strict laws on anything that causes cancer. So I think alcohol is captured in that too.
gotcha. Okay, I think I'll hold any other questions till after we run through it with Tucker, but anything else for Rep. Nugent? All right, cool. Thank you.
Right, back at it. Tucker Anderson, Legislative Counsel. You have in front of you H 376 as introduced. I'll start on page 2 and move very quickly through the page because this page contains primarily the legislative findings. And if you have not heard this from Legislative Counsel yet, glad to be the first to tell you that we do not vet the legislative findings. So you should review these and make sure that they are accurate for what your findings of fact related to this subject matter are. So noting that subsection A contains the General Assembly's findings, I will move into subsection B, which is the statement of intent that will guide the construction of the various statutes amended by this act moving forward. The intent is that all alcoholic beverages sold in the state will bear a label that discloses the alcohol content, adequate to inform the consumer of serving size, and that it is consistent through all beverage alcohol categories. And finally, that the gallonage tax on alcoholic beverages be increased to offset the cost of support services. All right. We're on page 3. Section 2. A new section 6 is added to Title 7. And before I get too far ahead of myself, I know that this is only the second alcoholic beverage bill that you've worked on this session. And the first was just amending a prospective repeal. So please tell me if I'm moving too quickly or if you have questions about the alcoholic beverage categories or some of the nuance as I move through the sections. This section is being added to create some state level labeling requirements. And at one point, I will note for you a provision in here that is expressly preempted by federal law. And throughout, I will do my best to try to describe to you what is within the state's control as far as labeling requirements are concerned. Subsection A, this is going to be labeling requirements for malt, vinous, and ready-to-drink spirits beverages. Those are all lumped together because they are outside of the DLL distribution stream. A manufacturer or rectifier of those beverages shall not sell or distribute in the state unless the labeling or packaging of the product includes a statement of alcohol content in U.S. standard drinks. So currently, alcohol by weight or volume. This would shift it to a standard drink calculation for purposes of sales within Vermont. The statement of alcohol content shall be in a format permitted under the labeling regulations adopted by the TTB. So that's the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau. The TTB is granted authority under federal law to adopt regulations governing the labeling of alcoholic beverage products. And for those of you who were here in the past, you'll know some of the intricacies of labeling if you were here for the cider discussions when Vermont was creating the cider definition. For the TTB regulations, they parse out, for example, Perry's, which is the fun name that's given to a pear cider. Subsection B, this is going to apply to spirits and fortified wines. It is going to contain the exact same labeling requirements. The one call out here is that DLL and any manufacturer or rectifier is required to put the label on beverages sold within the state. That's for spirits and fortified wines. DLL, being the state's wholesaler of spirits, is given this duty to affix a label. And it may be something you want to explore with DLL as far as what some of their current labeling practices are. Importers and wholesalers do have some discretionary authority to add labels, particularly when importing alcoholic beverages from other countries that don't have, for example, some of the labels required. It would be readable by a US consumer. Metric conversions and whatnot. So we're on page 4 now, moving into subsection C. Subsection C states that any alcoholic beverage sold in the state shall bear a cancer warning and serving facts label. The cancer warning shall state, warning, drinking alcoholic beverages may increase cancer risk and if consumed during pregnancy can cause birth defects. So that is the required language, but in quotes, that would need to be on the label. The serving facts, separate from that warning, shall state the following: serving size in US standard drinks, alcohol by volume, calories per US standard drink, and measurement in grams for total fat, saturated fat, sodium, total carbohydrates, total sugars, added sugars, and protein. Now, 2 sentences in subsection C are in all likelihood 99.99% certainty level here preempted by federal law, specifically 27 USC section 216, which states that these sorts of health warnings are expressly preempted by the labeling requirements adopted under those provisions of Title 27. The third component dealing with the serving facts label, not as clear. Now, Representative Nugent pointed out that California has a fairly comprehensive cancer warning disclosure requirement. The one distinction that I would draw there is that, to my knowledge, that is not required to go on the label that is affixed to certain products such as alcoholic beverages. It is just a required consumer disclosure. So that may be a way of navigating some of the preemption here, is by requiring in certain places a health disclosure around alcoholic beverages, but not requiring the label that is affixed to a container to bear this notice. These other facets, including subsection A and subsection B, some of these labeling requirements, likely can be regulated by the states. And we have a few examples of where there is state level regulation of labels. Utah does have some state specific labeling requirements around alcoholic beverages. Until fairly recently, let's say the mid 2000s, Texas had some very curious labeling requirements for malt beverages that were overturned not on the merits of the arguments of the parties, but instead because, at least according to the decision issued by the courts, the attorney general failed to appear to defend the state's position on that particular case. And in California, not a health disclosure, but a geographic location labeling requirement for wines has been upheld by the Supreme Court of California. So there's room to regulate labeling within this context, just not within the context of a health statement. It would conflict with the health statements required expressly under Title 27. Okay. If we're ready to move into taxes.
Please.
Ask a question.
Oh, yes, please. Representative Pistol, sorry.
Is there any warning on your cans now or any alcohol? Is there any warning on them now?
Yes, there's a Surgeon General's warning, which is the health warning that's required by Title 27.
Do you know how long those labels have been on? Or how long that requirement's been in place at the federal level?
I wish my encyclopedic knowledge was that deep and that specific.
Okay.
No, I do not.
Rep. Nugent?
I could provide a non-detailed answer. It's been a while and they're supposed to update it regularly when new information arises and they have not.
1988.
Thank you.
Say this was a wager, I would have said 1988.
All right, look at you.
That's when the federal highway grants were tied to, for example, raising the age.
Oh, 21. Understood. Okay.
Pretty comprehensive alcoholic beverage related federal regulations passed around that time.
A lifetime ago.
Exactly one Tucker lifetime. Sure was. Without my exact birth date or other personal identifying information on the record. Section 3, amendment 7 VSA section 421. We're going to deal with two sections governing taxes on different forms of alcoholic beverages in the beverage categories. This deals with the malt, vinous, and ready to drink spirits beverages. So first, the tax on, well, we'll just move through this. In subdivision 1, increased from 26.5 cents to $1.36 per gallon for malt beverages sold by retailers in the state. Currently, there is two different tax rates applied to malt beverages depending on the percentage of alcohol. That eliminates that distinction and just has a $1.26 tax on malt beverage by the gallon.
Okay, so that right there would equalize the taxation rate across those three different types.
Yes, including hard ciders.
Yes. Okay.
In subdivision 2, the tax on vinous beverages is increased from 55 cents to $3.75 per gallon. And finally, the ready-to-drink spirits beverages are raised from $1.10 per gallon to $1.36, which matches the tax on malt beverages and ciders. A new subsection G is added to the section requiring that beginning on July 1st, 2027, and on each subsequent July 1st, the sums, the taxes that are set in this section shall be increased by the percentage increase of the CPI city average, not seasonally adjusted, as calculated by the U.S. Department of Labor for the 12 months preceding the previous September 1st, and shall be rounded off to the nearest 1 cent. And this automatic increaser or adjustment clause is used in a few other instances in state law, including a few areas in Title 21. A close parallel would be similar subsection for the minimum wage.
Is that type of inflationary adjustment anywhere else on a product taxation? I mean, I'm familiar with the minimum wage adjustment, but it being applied to something, yeah,
That would immediately come to mind.
thank you.
I can look into that for you. All right. Gonna skip section 4 for now, because it would make more sense after we cover section 5. Section 5, this is the tax on spirits and fortified wines, which is a tax on the gross revenue from the sale of spirits and fortified wines, and it is increased from 5 to 10%. And there is some history within this section of the tax rates being different depending on volume of spirits that are manufactured by a particular manufacturer. At one point it was 10%, and beginning maybe 10 years ago in a series of amendments, it was all consolidated down to one tax rate at 5%. Here raised back to 10. So going back to section 4, this adds a new section 421A to Title 7, creating the Treatment and Recovery Fund. Subsection A creates the fund, which is a special fund established and managed pursuant to applicable provisions of Title 32, and that is administered by the Department of Health. The fund will consist of all monies collected by the Commissioner of Taxes pursuant to section 421, and 50% of the monies collected by the Board of Liquor and Lottery pursuant to section 424. So all of the gallonage tax that is collected by the Commissioner of Taxes would go into this fund, and then half of the tax on the gross sale of spirits would go in, and that would be the amount that is increased taxed in section 422. Subsection B, the department shall submit a spending plan to the General Assembly annually on or before November 15th, and shall disperse monies from the fund pursuant to the applicable provisions of Title 32. Subsection C, this is going to be the uses of the monies in the fund. Expenditures may be used to support any program that provides mental health support for primary and post-secondary schools, with priority given to the support for student assistance professionals, or treatment or supportive housing for individuals with alcohol use disorder.
Okay.
All right. Jump to page 7, section 6. This is a requirement for a study from the Division of Liquor Control concerning retailer compliance with direct-to-consumer shipping. On or before November 15th, DLC shall submit to your committee, Senate Committee on Economic Development, Housing, and General Affairs, a written report concerning the legal compliance of alcoholic beverage manufacturers, distributors, and retailers with the requirements of Vermont's consumer shipping laws. So those are your DTC shipping laws. The division shall specifically study and report on the rate of compliance for any person offering the online sale of alcoholic beverages. The division's current and planned compliance monitoring programs and recommended legislation or appropriations to support and improve compliance with Vermont's consumer shipping laws. And believe that the committee has access to the most recent report on this subject from DLL. They did a pilot study of direct consumer shipping and found a 0% compliance rate.
Yes, I believe the language was 40 out of 40 were not found to be wholly lawful. It was different. Compliant, yes, sorry. And so there was like variables within the like compliance issues in there.
Down.
Yes. They weren't all the same problem, but everybody had a problem.
Well put. The effective date is July 1st, 2025.
Okay. All right, thank you, council. Any questions for Tucker on this? All right. Rep. Nugent, anything to add before we shift gears?
Couple of things I forgot to mention. I think one is that the last time we raised the tax on alcohol was 1981. I was 4 years old, speaking of years. And the cost to taxpayers per drink is about $2.05, or that was the last time it was estimated by CDC, which was in 2015. So it's probably higher. So we're charging people 2 cents a drink now, and it costs us about $2.05 in taxes to deal with the issues.
Okay, I see what you're saying. I see ahead.
Bob got a catch.
Compliance, section 6, November 15th, 2024.
Oh, just the date catch?
On your
Yep. Gotcha.
on retro.
It's one of the magical
I
powers.
noted that one. Yep.
I don't think he did that.
Okay.
That's the one.
All right, well, we'll stop here with this one right now. Yeah, these are always big conversations when you start talking about beverage taxes and stuff like that. So I do want to shift over and welcome Madam Secretary, please join us.
So much for inviting me.
Yeah. It's been a little while since we've seen you. How you been?
You know, it's been a busy couple of weeks, as you might imagine.
Hence us reaching out to you. Yeah. So what we wanted to do here was just kind of get a sort of a situational update, given the activity at the federal level with some executive orders and other conversations in and around legislation at the federal level that could impact or is impacting elections. I mean, I heard you speak at a function about a week and a half ago to some of this, and I've seen some of the comments that you've been making in the media and publicly. So that really is one of the things that sparked me wanting to reach out to you so the committee could get a sense of what you and your office is seeing.
And I thank you for that opportunity. I think I want to say first and foremost that the March 25th executive order requiring documentary proof of citizenship to remain on the voter rolls and the SAVE Act, which passed the House last week, have given a lot of uncertainty and are raising a lot of questions on the part of our local elections administrators in Vermont. Our town and city clerks are very agitated about it. In fact, on behalf of many of their assistant clerks, have expressed fear that their assistant clerks may quit. In many offices, the assistant clerk is the one who's sort of taken on the duty of keeping the voter registration applications updated and entered into the system. And so the fear and nervousness is centered around the fact that both the executive order and the SAVE Act would create criminal penalties for registering someone to vote in the absence of them showing documentary proof of citizenship. There are not criminal penalties for doing your duty as an elected clerk in most, if not all, of the duties of a clerk. And for this to be coming forward is something that is new and different for them. I want to talk a little bit about what documentary proof of citizenship is, because some people are like, well, doesn't that just mean that you show your driver's license and you're done and you're good to go? Unfortunately, no, because of the 500,000 driver's licenses or driver's permit cards that are issued in the state of Vermont, only 118,000 of them are the enhanced real ID. And the enhanced real ID is the only kind of driver's license that one can get that will be a proof of citizenship. Another straightforward way of showing proof of citizenship is if you have a passport. And what I know about my neighbors in rural Eastern Orange County is that many of them have never traveled internationally. In fact, going to Burlington is it's a big deal and something that they might do, once a year, if that. And so for many of them, the expense and hurdles necessary to get a passport at $180 and whatnot is just not something that they have ever needed to do. So how do you prove citizenship if you don't have an enhanced real ID and if you don't have a passport? You would need to have a certified copy of your birth certificate. Having had the chance to look at a few copies of people's original birth certificates, I can tell you many of those would give pause to a clerk or an assistant clerk now because they really were literally either handwritten or created on a typewriter. And the method of certification or stamping of birth certificates 60 or 70 or 80 years ago is very different, looks very different than what you might see for a certified birth certificate today. Your certified birth certificate then would show your name at birth, and you would need to couple that with a photo ID that shows a picture of you and your name now. But for anyone whose name has changed since they were born, if, say, for instance, if they were adopted or if they changed their name when they got married, there would need to be other intervening documentation shown in order to prove that this person who was born in this town and city and state is this person who currently is presenting an ID. So that puts another hurdle in front of married women, in front of adoptees, and frankly, in front of anyone who has moved geographically since they were born or since they were married, because then it would require folks to go through whatever application process that vital records holder has in order to get copies of their documentary proof of citizenship and their proof of name change. Court decrees, marriage licenses, these are things that will present hurdles for people to be able to assemble those documents.
Representative Hango.
Thank you. I have a question, and it's been a few years now, so I don't really remember exactly, but it seems like we had to go through that to get our real IDs. And now I just was at the airport this morning and there are big signs everywhere. Do you have your real ID yet? Because the deadline is coming. So we had to jump through all of those hoops. So how is this different than having to have a real ID?
So a real ID is one step down from an enhanced real ID, and a real ID is available as a document to allow for plane travel for anyone who is a legal permanent resident or a citizen. And so in order to get that enhanced real ID, that's the one where you have to show proof of citizenship.
Because I remember having to do that, but I don't have an enhanced.
You have a
license.
star on your license.
I do.
I have a star on my license
Yeah,
as well,
but it's
but I have seen the enhanced driver's license because my deputy has an enhanced real ID. And it says right on it next to the star, enhanced real ID. And now everybody's pulling out their wallet.
Yeah, I'm like,
Yeah, so I looked and I knew this testimony was coming, so I was kind of curious about that because I recall I had to provide things like proof that I paid an electric bill, that I was living in a certain location at the address that I listed. I had to provide a birth certificate. I had to provide all of those things. So I'm not really sure what the difference is between needing an enhanced real ID and needing a real ID.
Right. And I wonder if that was a choice that you could have made when you were at the DMV. I have not looked at the DMV list of required documentation for the real ID or the enhanced real ID. But the statistics are recent. We did ask in the last week and we found that of the 500,000 permitted drivers in the state, there's 118,000 enhanced real IDs.
And I think in Vermont, any state that borders a foreign country, to get an enhanced ID is a good idea because you can drive back and forth without having, yes, if you're driving, you can do that. But I guess I'm not sure about the elections piece, why an enhanced ID is different from a real ID. I guess that's where my confusion is.
Because the real ID is able to be issued to permanent residents who are not citizens. Right.
and the enhanced is for.
The enhanced,
Citizens. Yes, so that's the delineation.
I guess that's why I'm not understanding why I had to prove citizenship to get just a real ID.
Do you have your ID on?
Yeah.
Mike says.
Yeah, mine's just got a star. It's not an enhanced.
Mine says enhanced, it's got an American flag and
Yeah, no,
Yeah, mine
and that's
does not.
that makes it.
But I had to prove citizenship to get a real ID.
Representative Pistol, that's the hand up.
So if, to make matters simpler, if when this whole thing comes to fruition, if it does, is there two things? Is there any way that the DMV system would be able to tell clerks who already has the enhanced license? So they wouldn't have to require all the documentation. And number two, if you already have the enhanced license, could you just show that and let the clerk update your system without having to go through the whole process of starting all over again?
these are certainly things that we're exploring because that would be the most straightforward way for a citizen to establish that they should be added to the voter roll. So in the event that the SAVE Act moves forward or the executive order is allowed to stand, we certainly will begin to pursue that. The other layer of this is that the consequences to the DMV for being a part of our automatic voter registration system have never been criminal consequences. And so if it's a matter of maintaining the ability to automatically register to vote through the Department of Motor Vehicles, that would then raise the stakes for the DMV tellers who are essentially acting as election officials in that moment. So it calls into question whether we will be able to continue to do that. But certainly, as you say, if there's an easy way for them to transfer to us the data on enhanced real IDs, then we certainly will want to pursue that.
So do you know what is required to get an enhanced at this point?
Well, I mean, to Representative Hango's confusion, it's largely what you need to present in order to get a real ID. The difference is that a real ID can be issued to a legal permanent resident, and that legal permanent resident would need to show evidence of their permanent status. Probably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Representative Hango.
So I think that's it in a nutshell. It's the same proofs. And including whether you can prove you're a citizen or not, or whether you're just a legal non-citizen resident. but there is a difference in cost to get the enhanced stamp on it. So I don't think there's any difference in what you have to provide the issuing agency. I think it's just a matter of cost and not being able to get an enhanced real ID unless your proof of residence shows that you're a citizen. I would really want to hear from somebody at DMV who knows the difference between one license and the other. Thanks.
Yeah, no, with this, like, I just want to dip our toes in the water to get sort of just a mid-range level understanding of what these things were, these new conversations were
So
theoretically going to require. Sorry.
if there's time, I would love to just run through a few other concerns that our office has with respect to how we would implement this. We would, if we were required to implement this, we would seek to do it in a way that that you would not have to re-present all of your documentary proof of citizenship if you moved from one town to another. We would need to be able to capture proof that those documents have been presented to the election official. So probably capturing images and storing them in a secure environment. Certainly with concerns about identity theft, we would want to make sure that that secure environment was very carefully thought out and that access to those documents and images of those documents was very clearly laid out. Does town clerk in town B, where I move to in 5 years, get to have access, and by whose permission? Does any town clerk in the state have the ability to look at the documents that I presented in order to get on the voter registration rolls? So these are all questions that we would need to think through and think very carefully about how people feel about, open access to their own documentation. We talked a little bit about the criminal penalties and the anxiety that that's producing for our town and city clerks. I want to talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of how you get your documentary proof of citizenship, because I started down this path when the executive order came out on March 25th. And I'm a pretty savvy person. I'm lucky enough to work in a situation where I'm behind a computer most days. I have access to a printer. I have access to a photocopier. But I think about all of my neighbors who work behind a cash register or swing a hammer or work, out of their truck for themselves and have most of their online access available only through their handheld device. That would make it much more challenging. So I needed to request a certified copy of my birth certificate. So I went to Lake Forest, Illinois, and saw the city website, and it said, order your birth certificate here. The link to the application form was dead and didn't upload the document that I needed. So I just called them. Again, the privilege of sitting behind a desk and having the ability to do these things. The woman that I spoke to on the phone said, "Oh, I'm so sorry that link is broken. I can email the form directly to you." Okay. So she emailed me the form and I printed it out and I wrote a check. How many 20-somethings have a checkbook? What do you pay for your documentation with?
Not the only
have a checkbook. That was the only form of remittance that I could offer to Lake Forest, Illinois. And interestingly enough, about a week later, I got an email from the woman who had sent me the form to begin with. And she said, "Oh, we only hold records going back 10 years. You need to go to Lake County to get your documentation. So we're going to mail your check and your photocopy of your driver's license and the application form back to you. And you're going to have to go to the county." So then I had to start that process over again. Photocopy of the front and back of my driver's license this time, another check. So if I'd had to get a cashier's check the first time around, I would be headed back to the bank during normal banking hours to get another copy of a cashier's check if I don't have a checking account. And long story short, I still don't have copies of my birth certificate. My marriage license was a little bit easier because I was married in Vermont, and those vital records are kept physically at Vasara and are maintained by the Department of Health. So that was a quick online application. I was able to pay with my credit card, and the copy of my marriage certificate came a week later. So these are hoops that people would have to jump through. And, you know, one of the deep concerns that I have is if the upcoming election sneaks up on you, as it does on many Vermonters. We are now 2.5, 3 weeks into this process for me to get my documentation, and I still don't have it. And so, you know, I have a lot of concerns about the number of people that this would disenfranchise, at least in the first election cycle. I have concerns about the cost that it would, that our office would incur in needing to upgrade our IT systems, as I said, to capture and securely maintain the images of those documents. But my biggest concern really is in the cost to our municipal offices, because Representative Pinsonneau knows anytime you have a face-to-face interaction with one of your constituents, you know, there's some business that you transact, but then there's a lot of other things that happen in that conversation. Some of them pleasantries, and some of them maybe, you know, venting or grumpy grumbling about having to jump through this hurdle or pay my property taxes or whatnot. I can imagine that in a best case scenario, this is a 10-minute interaction with each voter to be able to look at, capture images of, and verify multiple documents, and then hand those back to the constituent. So 10 minutes times how many voters do you have on your checklist? And if we want to continue to offer, as our state law allows, same-day voter registration, that will be a huge additional investment on the part of each of our local elections offices, because the person who's going to be sitting at that voter registration table is going to be taking on the threat of criminal penalty. And I can't imagine that our elections offices are going to be able to do that with an elections volunteer. It's going to have to be the town or city clerk or a sworn assistant. So that's a huge impact on our laws in Vermont. We have had same-day voter registration for many years. We had nearly 7,000 Vermonters take advantage of that in the last election, which I think is a beautiful thing to see 7,000 people able to participate without having that arbitrary deadline of several weeks before the election. And so this will mean a significant change to the way we administer elections in Vermont. We are watching the lawsuit that our Attorney General and 18 other attorneys general have filed against the executive order. I feel fairly confident that the executive order is not the legal and constitutional way to accomplish these changes to election law, because the United States Constitution says very clearly that the states determine the time, place, and manner of conducting federal elections, and that only Congress can put parameters around that, as they have done a number of times, mainly intended to improve and increase voter access with the NVRA and UOCAVA, those kinds of laws that Congress has put in place in order to improve people's access to the ballot box. Watching the SAVE Act power through the House without any committee hearings gave a number of secretaries of state across the country a great deal of frustration, particularly because there was never any consideration of inviting state election officials to come in and testify about the impacts, nor is there any funding tied to the SAVE Act in order to compensate state election officials and local election officials for the expense of this increased requirement on how we conduct federal elections. The other aspect of a change to our elections that we might have to consider if this were to go into effect is, can we decouple state elections from federal elections? so that in order to vote in a state election, you don't have to meet that hurdle of showing documentary proof of citizenship, but could we maintain our normal self-attestation? I check the box, I am 18 years old, I am a citizen of the United States under pains and penalties of perjury, and I sign my name. Doing that again would mean additional expense on election day for how we print ballots, because the federal elections would have to be on one ballot and the state elections would have to be on a separate ballot. So that's doubling the ballot costs, but it's also doubling the cost of staffing your polling places, because you would need to have a separate checklist for the people who are eligible to vote in the federal election and the people who are eligible to vote in state elections. So could we decouple? That's something we're exploring. But again, it is a huge additional expense to have to maintain those two separate voting methods. And that says nothing about what the expense would be to the state in terms of how we adapt our election management system to essentially have parallel voter checklists. One for people who have proved citizenship and are allowed to vote in federal elections, and one for people who are citizens who have not shown all of their documentation. So these are all questions that we're exploring and concerns that we have. And we're certainly expressing these concerns to our federal delegation and talking with other secretaries of state about anything that they might have in terms of ideas on how we could implement this if we have to, in a way that doesn't disenfranchise voters. And before I get done and give you all an opportunity to ask any remaining questions, I did want to just talk a little bit about the why. The rationale that has been put forward for why the executive order and why the SAVE Act has been that that there are non-citizens who are swaying elections in the United States, and that we must tamp this out with every tool that we have in place because of the threat of non-citizens influencing our elections. The Brennan Center for Justice did a comprehensive analysis of 2016 elections with 23 million voters across the United States and found only 30 instances of a non-citizen voting in that election. And for the math geeks out there, that is 0.0001%. And if you multiply 0.0001% by the roughly 375,000 voters that we have in a Vermont general election, it would take us 3 whole election cycles or 6 years to get to one whole person statistically in that analysis. And so this is a tremendous inconvenience and expense to individuals in Vermont to have to gather their documentary proof of citizenship, to take time off of work in order to present that in person to their own town and city clerks. And as I talked before about the impact to the clerk's offices, the extra hours and time that it would take to evaluate all of that documentation. And at the end of the day, I just fall back on the very firm belief that if the federal government believes that it's important for citizens to be able to document and show citizenship in order to get on the voter registration rolls, then there ought to be a federal agency who's tasked with the responsibility to provide documentary proof of citizenship to every one of us free of charge. If we want government to work for the people, then government should be taking on the financial responsibility for doing this. And right now, we see the federal government saying, well, we don't do citizenship and it's not our thing. And the Association of Motor Vehicle Agencies says drivers' privileges were never intended to be used as citizenship documents. They are intended to prove that you know how to safely operate a vehicle, and you can't make us be the keepers of people's citizenship proof and documentation, because this is not what we were designed to do. And so the fact of the matter is there is no government agency at this moment who can provide these documents to citizens. And I think that this solution would be much more manageable if there were a government agency that was tasked with and funded with the responsibility of providing documentation to citizens.
Now, do I recall, I think this was in the context of the executive order, was there also language in that about limiting early voting or
So
paper ballot only?
yes, paper ballot only, which doesn't impact us because we have only paper ballots. We can go back and audit
Yep.
An election up to 22 months afterward because clerks are required to keep those ballots for 22 months after the election. So that doesn't impact us. It does impact some of the states who do electronic
Yeah, the
collection of,
touch screen.
touch screen and, punch card, whatever, all of those different things. There is language in both the executive order and I believe the SAVE Act that would prohibit states from being able to count ballots that are received after Election Day. We don't have that as a part of our election law in Vermont. Your ballot has to be in your clerk's hands by 7 p.m. on Election Day. But there are some states who, because of delays in the mail and because of the belief that putting it in the mail by Election Day ought to be enough. There are some states who will count it if it's postmarked.
Mhm.
Again, that doesn't impact Vermont, but it does impact some vote by mail states and would require them to change their procedures in order to continue to receive ballots.
So, but none of that has a bearing on us.
That's correct.
Okay. And then this is my last question from my recollection bucket, from reading the media. Was there something in there about like, a non-compliance by the states to these directives, putting, election support money from the federal government in jeopardy?
Yes, not only election support money, but the executive order references other grants, such as grants to law enforcement in the state, and that non-compliance could put other federal grants in jeopardy. That's a little harder to understand where that link comes because I don't know why law enforcement would be tied to elections conduct. But that's one of the things that was in the executive order. I can't say for sure whether it's also in the SAVE Act. But the threat of loss of future funding is one part of this, but the fact that there's no funding to support the implementation of this to begin with is really the big stunner, because the states are conducting federal elections on behalf of the federal government, and that has always been the agreement, that the states can determine the time, place, and manner, and that the federal government will help to fund the things that the federal government has required of the states. And the SAVE Act and the executive order really break that promise.
Understood. I feel like I've been asking all the questions so far for the most part, but Representative Pistol.
This is sort of like what happened when they came out with the new licenses and everybody was coming in to get birth certificates or marriage licenses because their name didn't match what their license, that they were born with, because everybody had, and I'll tell you, they'd come in with all kinds of and it'd be 3 or 4 visits to DMV before they had all the documentation and a lot of frustration. Yeah, so I can.
That's
see-
why 10 minutes per transaction is probably a little bit wishful, because that means that somebody didn't want to tell you how grumpy they are, that they had to take a half a day off of work to get to your office before you closed.
Rep. Waters Evans, then Stone.
I had a couple questions. Are those 0.0001 across the country? How many of those have been in Vermont in recent history?
We don't know of any.
Not any ever.
We don't.
Okay.
We have seen instances of non-citizens actually accidentally getting on the voter registration rolls. And in one case that I know of, the clerk called the person and said, "You're not yet a citizen, right?" And this person said, no, take me off. And in another instance, the citizen or the non-citizen, the legal permanent resident themselves, was looking at the voter registration list and saw that their name was on it and called the clerk and said, please take me off immediately. Because, you know, the idea that somebody who is living here and likes living here and perhaps is raising a family, owns a business, you know, working to send money home to folks that they left behind. The idea that they would commit a deportable offense that would bar them from ever being able to achieve citizenship is sort of nonsensical. I mean, that's why people are very careful not to end up on the voter registration rolls and to ask to be taken off. And in fact, they're quite indignant if it happened. And usually we found that those mistakes happen by somebody not checking the right box at the DMV or not understanding that process well enough. So we're committing to refreshing that training with the Department of Motor Vehicles so that their frontline tellers know exactly how to advise people when they're going through the checklist to get their driver's license.
Thanks. My next question is, so I was born in Missouri, and two of my children were born in New York, and one was born in Vermont. And all of our birth certificates, I was born decades before they were, but they were all within a few years.
Yeah.
Their birth certificates are all wildly different.
Yeah.
Just based on what town you live in and not even the state. So can you describe how a town clerk in a regular small town in Vermont would go about discerning whether or not a person was citizen or had adequate proof to be on the voter roll if there's no standard, as you said, that would be ideal, but there are a million different ways these things could look. So how would it work?
I mean, that is the crux of the anxiety that I'm hearing from town and city clerks right now, because they can imagine how difficult it would be. And they can imagine how hard it would be if their neighbor, who they've lived next to their entire life, comes in with her original hand-scripted birth certificate from 80 years ago and says, I've had this in my files for 80 years. Take this as proof that I was born here. And how does a clerk know that that will be adequate documentation? Because it doesn't. Those certifications look different in different decades. They look different in different jurisdictions. And that will be extremely difficult. It's not like there's a directory that you can look up and say, oh, this is what Sioux Falls birth certificates look like. So this looks pretty legitimate. There's no directory of that.
And sorry, I have a million questions, but I'll stop with this one. So, and then once you get past that level of the town clerk saying, okay, sure, yes, Shay, you were born here, you're a citizen, this is great. Is there like an audit above it somewhere? Is the Secretary of State's office going to be expected to check this? Is there some kind of federal check of, does Charlotte, Vermont have only citizens on there? Like,
So
what happens after?
that's a really good question. And I don't know if the SAVE Act specifies anything, but there was some language in the executive order that is fairly concerning because it does require us to give the Department of Homeland Security certain information and open information, which presumably could be images of some of this documentation or allow them to spot check or audit. It's just not clear how enforceable that is in an executive order method of implementation, but it raises serious concerns about who has access to that information going forward.
Thanks.
I got Rep. Stone.
I'm just reading through the bill and it says that it specifies if someone registers by mail, they must present documents in person to the office of the appropriate election official. I was wondering if you could talk about how that can negatively impact our service members who are serving abroad and folks with disabilities who may, and rural Vermonters who don't have access to transportation, public transportation to get to Sandy.
Rural, low income, elderly, people with limited mobility. This would be a serious barrier to them. But I didn't get a chance to run through all of the things that it would change. It would make it extremely difficult to verify the documentary proof of citizenship of a military or overseas voter. Because again, it would be your clerk's liability on the line if he or she were to accept documents that were later proven to be improper. And so that would essentially eliminate the online voter registration capabilities and that we have had in Vermont for many, many years. And it would make it next to impossible to register people who are not physically present or not able to go in person to the office.
Okay. So. All right, I have like a bottomless pit of questions. Stop. Okay, I saw Sandy's hand next, then Bob.
Well, the
Jumped in
good thing
before.
about Vermont, if you were born in Vermont and you go to your town clerk's office, you can enter, the clerk can go into the Vermont Health login portal and can get you your birth certificate. But if you were born someplace else, then you gotta go the routes, and some states are counting, some states are, like central, like New York is like mostly Albany, unless records are still kept at some of those little villages or little towns. But then you get your marriage, so then you don't know where you're being charged to get, so then you're gonna go to, your name's changed from your birth, and you gotta find that. And sometimes if you've kept your you've been married and divorced, but you kept your first husband's last name. I mean, it's
So many variables.
so many variables.
In that case, you better hope that you didn't burn that original marriage certificate celebrating the divorce. You're gonna have to go and get another
Right.
copy of it.
Like we said, variables.
Don't put those in the bonfire, people.
And if you were married in Vermont, it'd be easy to get your marriage certificate. You could do it through the portal. But other states who don't have those, again, and if you don't have access to that. So, but again, it's more than 10 minutes.
Representative Hoover.
So has anybody done a breakdown of how suppressed the voter turnout is gonna be?
So we can speculate. We can speculate that, it would be very easy for people who are privileged enough to have needed a passport. I don't have current statistics on how many Vermonters have a passport, but it's probably similar to the number of Vermonters who have an enhanced driver's license, maybe some overlap with that population. So those two groups will have an easier time of it. Again, that's 118,000 enhanced driver's license, maybe half of the Vermont population has a passport. But, people who have mobility challenges, people who live in one rural town but work 45 minutes away and leave before the clerk's office opens and don't usually get back to town until after they close will be put at a disadvantage. They will be required to take time off of work in order to get registered to vote. So we haven't really gone that next step of speculating who will have the motivation to jump through these hoops and to cross all of those hurdles in time to vote. Because fundamentally, I don't believe that we should be putting those kinds of barriers in front of people's ability to vote. When you are a citizen in this country, you should not have to take on the time and expense of doing all of those activities because voting is foundational.
Yes,
It would be ideal, and this would be a great, amazing thing that if it could happen, is anybody who's been issued a real ID had to prove their citizenship, and anybody with an enhanced, and it'd be really great if they could print out by town, every citizen in Alberg, here's your list, the clerk could just match them up.
We would certainly be looking for
It's gonna take
shortcuts like
Right.
that to establish if this were to become law, so that instead of that person having to show you their documentation, you could log into the portal and say, oh, yep, I see Mrs. Jones. You have an enhanced ID. You've already shown citizenship at the DMV, so you don't need to do it here. That would be ideal. I don't know whether The Save Act allows that. The executive order says very clearly that you must show documentary proof of citizenship in person. Presumably you've done that in person at the DMV, but can we use that process that was established years ago and that maybe you followed years ago when you got your enhanced going forward to indemnify your clerk from consequences if he or she adds you to the voter registration rolls? These are questions I don't know the answer to.
Representative Ango?
This is very simplistic and maybe I missed something along the line, but if I have my real ID, which has my picture on it, and I take it to go vote in person and show it to the person at the polls, is that not all the proof that would be needed? So what else would be needed?
You would either need an enhanced ID or you would need to have registered to vote with your birth certificate and your current picture ID and any other documentation that links this name to this name if your name has changed since you were born. And so this is, as I said, probably a 10-minute interaction for the clerk to be able to capture images of your birth certificate, your marriage or divorce decree, your adoption papers, and your current government issued photo ID.
What if your enhanced real ID, maybe that's what I'm getting at, has your current name? So presumably you would have had to present all of that to get an enhanced real
Yes.
ID. What if you take that into your voting booth?
Our understanding is that if you have a passport or if you have an enhanced real ID, that would be the only documentation that you would be required to show to get on the voter registration rolls. So it would be a two-step process. You're not just showing this to the check-in table. You actually have to get yourself onto the voter registration rolls beforehand,
Yeah.
or your clerk will have to develop some way of having
Checklist.
you able to do that in one line at the polling place and then be able to get registered.
Because people can register the day of the election, can register to vote.
That is what Vermont law
Right.
specifies.
So
Yes.
if you had that proper documentation, and in this case, it would be a card that you would have gotten previously. It's the folks who don't have those that would encounter your 10-minute process.
If, assuming they actually knew what they needed to bring with them.
Yeah.
In order to same day register.
I'm just imagining, because it's Vermont law, like what if someone shows up at the polls at 6:59, they close at 7, they come up to you, or I keep looking at Sandy.
Any election.
Whatever, any election official, and I mean, that gets sticky, right? Like you would have to like deny them the right to vote because you couldn't get your ducks in a row to make sure that their current ID matches, that matches the birth certificate, like I could just see that being. Have to be turning people away, it sounds like.
Well, we certainly hope that clerks will honor anyone who made it into line by 7 PM to allow them time to get through the process. I don't know of any cases where clerks slam the door and kick people out if they didn't finish the process. Would never disagree.
I just know in my district, a lot of people work and their kids in school and like they all come in at like 7 o'clock, 6:59. I just see this being a real challenge. Anyway, okay, that's fine.
Rep. Nugent?
I just wanted to go back to something you said about it's normally federal government doesn't, it sounds like they don't normally get into this too much of weeds with states. And is there any other? Yeah, I just was wondering if you could talk more about that, because I'm aware of like the 1960s law that required some states to do more to make sure that they were franchising people, but not more of the, yeah.
Yeah, so, you know, the NVRA was passed and intended to sort of streamline and systematize the way states register people to vote so that there weren't different hurdles being put in front of people in different states. You know, we all remember our history lessons about poll taxes and our history lessons about literacy tests being administered to people as a way of keeping them from being able to vote. So as I said before, these laws have always been put in place with the intention of enfranchising citizens to vote, as opposed to this, which would create a real hurdle and would create disenfranchisement for rural, elderly, low income, people who've moved, people who've been married, people who've been adopted. So it's very different than anything that we've seen proposed in the past.
Please.
Just wondering if you could talk about too, like how we enforce rights versus privilege. Voting is a right, it's not a privilege. So I'm thinking of other rights that we have, like free speech, and we don't have a lot of laws around those, I don't think.
Yeah. Those have always held a sacred space within our legal system. The right to assemble, the right to speech, the right to vote, the right to practice your religion as you see fit, has always been held sacred. And voting is not a privilege. And I appreciate you calling that out, because in a democracy, in fact, voting should be your obligation and your right. And so we will certainly push to make sure that if this concept is moving forward, that it is done in a way that will not disenfranchise people.
So I kind of got a little, I don't want to say stuck, but speaking to like the right to the privilege, right? We're talking about using these enhanced IDs, driver's licenses, driving is a privilege, not a right. But we're trying to use our privileged ID, our ID of privilege, to be the vehicle to access the right.
Yeah.
So what if somebody has a suspended license?
What if you are 80 years old and you stopped driving, or you never drove? I mean, this is putting a requirement on someone in order to obtain their right to vote. You would have to go get a driver's privilege card or whatever photo ID is offered by your government entity. Again, that's a barrier being put between you and your ability to vote.
Yeah, I was just taking a look at the irony of the one that is the ID card of the privilege to drive being the instrument that you have to use to access your right to vote.
And the motor vehicles folks are saying, this was never our job. We're testing to make sure that you know what a stop sign looks like. We're not intended, we never intended to be the proof of citizenship document of choice. Yes.
I got the questions from Madam Secretary on this one.
This is really helping with recruiting clerks.
I'll just have a look. There's the training that was last week, the all day long Zoom. I was told by my assistant, because I was here, that people were getting up and leaving the room, they were just so frustrated, they just couldn't imagine what it was gonna be like. And they just were like, I'm not gonna have this, They're just very so frustrated with the whole thing.
So I held 2 open office hours last week, and I know you weren't able to be at them because you were doing your job here, to answer clerks' questions. And we had probably 70 clerks join one of those 2 sessions, which is pretty unheard of for busy clerks to take that time, especially when they're also taking time to do their election management system training over these couple of weeks now in April. We did send out a list of frequently asked questions to the clerks after those open office hours, and many of them have emailed me and said, thank you so much for this. This is very helpful. There's just a lot of anxiety and trepidation out there. I mean, is there anything else that you can think of in your duties as a clerk that would incur criminal penalties if you made a mistake?
No, because I've had the driver's license come through a motor vehicle, and I've sent them the registration form and had them call me and say, please take me off, I'm not a US citizen. So I've immediately removed them, but I wouldn't know other than coming to a voter. So, yeah, so it's, I haven't. As far as criminal, but that day, for those people who don't have the enhanced license. You'd have to have several checklists, like same day. Cause they'd still be on your checklist, but they wouldn't be allowed to vote, so you'd have to re-register them that day. Hopefully they'd bring all the documentation, it's gonna be a lot of voter education.
Right, that's part of the price tag of implementation, if we wanted to do this right in a way that doesn't.
They pay for that, they're gonna give the state money to educate people. You almost have to have like an open registration day. Like, bring your documents.
But they, I mean, you're doing this like mass re-registration in a process, right? Like this is.
Trying to be a failure.
Right.
No.
Well, that never easy, they also want to change the name, so they just have your birth certificate. Picture ID. And hopefully you have a picture ID, because if you don't have a driver's license, again, you have nothing to identify who you are. It's gonna be a mess.
Let's hope we don't get to this. Yeah, let's hope we don't get to this. Anything else for the secretary?
Well.
Thank you so much for giving me the time and for asking all of those really great questions. And we are happy to be of service if you have any other additional questions.
Thank you. And that is the last agenda item for the day. And if nobody else has any discussions on anything that we did, we'll just go offline for now and start with some of our work. I actually want to run out there and try and grab the secretary real quick.